Africa's call towards a step to reality, behold, the ancestors wish that a day shall dawn from the annals of creation to be known as Africa Day. Before you count your fingers comparatively with the coming years, man's anger will emerge like smoke fumes with Africa Day in its background. Behold, my son, behold that your pace is set on the right footing. Came from the west and sailed via the east, with hatred and disease flowing on their flesh, and a burden to harden our lives. They claimed to be friends when they found us friendly, and when they met being foreigners, they fought for the race. Exploiters of Africa, Africa my beginning and Africa my end. They asked Mugabe that unataka nini hapa ni nchi wewe. He said, binadamu wote ni ndugu zako na Afrika ni mcha. Ndataka mbari ya Zimbabwe mimi mwenyewe. In Africa my beginning, in Africa my end. Suckers of my country, they laid their sponges flat on its soil and absorbed its resources to feed their coffers. Agostino has spoken the language of the poets, that they went away in multitudes and forgot their hearts behind. But late is never a bad start. In Africa my beginning, and Africa my end. Lonely years, black hopeful men, food being their wish, courage as their pay. For once Africa was respected, for a leader has emerged, from the bush to Maputo, Viva Frelimo. Africa my ending. I remember Jatoibu. Namibia is not lost. Nujoma is not idle. He'll be a coward if he does. You might as well know that Germany is no more. In Africa my beginning, and Africa my end. Azania, here I come from apartheid in tatters, in the island of sorrow, for the marathon bandage, the Sharpeville massacre, the flames of Soweto. I was born there, and I will die there. From the dusty streets of the Ogaden desert, I saw red blood soaked with dusty soil, black Eritrea sons fighting tooth and nail to restore their heritage, the horn of Africa. Africa my beginning, and Africa my end. Let's do something more.
Molweni Sanbonani, Dumelang Absheni, Huyenant, Lochani Nda. Live from the SABC's Auckland Park studios. A warm welcome to this Africa Day edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvoko. Of course, that seminal poem we just played for you by the late Ingwapela Madingwane, kicking off our Africa Day edition of the Watchdog. 20 years since the formation of the African Union, the successor to the Organization of African Unity, we reflect on the accomplishments of the people of our continent, as well as the challenges they continue to endure. My first guest is South Africa's Minister of International Relations, Dr. Naledi Pandor. After that conversation, we move to another one with scholar and academic Dr. Blessing Masama, who looks at food security and malnutrition challenges in South Africa and in the rest of the continent, in line with this year's Africa Day theme. We'll also take you down memory lane to that famous speech by former President Thabo Mbeki.
I am an African.
All that and more in tonight's episode of the Watchdog, which starts right now. It's almost 20 years since African heads of state descended on Durban on the 9th of July 2002 to form the African Union, ostensibly to unite Africans as well as accelerate economic integration on our continent. The AU's predecessor, the Organization of African Unity, OAU, was founded on the same day in 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The contingent of African leaders who met in Durban in 1992, hosted by then South African President Thabo Mbeki, felt the continent needed a fresh start. 20 years later, what has the new organization given Africa that its forerunner couldn't? Has the AU lived up to its lofty ideals? For some reflection from a South African perspective, we are joined from Cairo, Egypt, by International Relations Minister Dr. Naledi Pandor. Good evening, Dr. Pandor, and thanks very much for your time.
Good evening, Buyo, and evening to the viewers of the Watchdog. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, sir, I mean, I did see a conversation between you and our foreign editor, Sophie Mukwena, earlier about the work you are there to do, and the president will be joining you there as well. Very briefly, how are things going with regard to preparations for that visit there?
Well, the meetings have gone exceptionally well. We have a very large delegation of officials from various departments, but I'm the only minister leading the delegation. The officials have been meeting for the past 3 days. They've had excellent deliberations and have elaborated a number of areas in which we would like to expand cooperation between the Republic of Egypt and the Republic of South Africa.
Why Egypt, and what are some of the areas you're looking at cooperating on?
Well, I think Egypt is a significant African economy, but also it has a very large and growing population. We also know that with the advent of the new government led by President al-Sisi, Egypt has set about implementing a very expansive infrastructure program throughout the country, including attempts at rural development, a focus on small towns to create job opportunities for communities that are often marginalized when economic development plans are implemented. Thirdly, it is a good partner for us, both in the context of the African Union, but also an important multilateral partner. So we've had very, very extensive discussions and have agreed that we want to lift the already very good relationship to much higher levels of collaboration.
Let's get then to the business of this evening, Africa Day, reflecting, of course, on what we've been able to do as a continent in the 20 years, since the launch in Durban of the African Union. And the reason we're only going back 20 years, of course, is in the interest of time. We can't go back to, when the OAU itself, was formed back in 1963. I had an interesting conversation, Minister, last week with the chairperson of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation. Geraldine Muleketi. And I wanted to take a listen to what she has, her opening remarks during that conversation. And you can tell me if you agree or disagree with her assessment of the past 20 years in a nutshell.
I'll start with quite a provocative quote that Professor Falula made when he said that Africa has been suffering from a leadership deficit, certainly at a cancerous rate, more than its trade deficit. He said few still exist that beacon the impeccable character that make up of the African personality. But he felt a solution has arrived through the school itself, and I'm sure Prof. Miller will speak about the school quite a bit. So coming back to your question as to whether the African Union has lived up to its lofty ambitions, very clearly, I think this is one thing that Professor Falula will talk about. But I think as we look at Agenda 2063 and we look at what the scorecard says on that, and there's been a second Continental Progress report that's been remarkably candid. And that report actually reflects that we've not done so well. You know, if we look 20 years ago, at that point, we experienced conflicts and coups on the continent. We also had the beating of drums internationally at that point. Quite ironically, those war drums are not only beating, but we've seen that reality as we looked at not only Europe, but you look at Yemen, you look at Ethiopia, and so on. So specifically, as it relates to the economic development on the continent, I think that there's a lot to be said on this. But we're talking about 54 countries. It's a checkered scorecard. We have a situation, for example, if we look at infrastructure development, that you have Trans-African Highway priority projects under Program for Infrastructure Development, and in certain areas such as the highway that's there from Lagos to Mombasa, Kenya has done very well. But when you look at other areas, you talk about only 70% of progress on that. So no, we've not really lived up to the lofty ideals. We've not done so from a leadership perspective to the extent required. And even when we've looked at Agenda 2063, not done as well as we should.
Would your own assessment, Minister, differ from hers?
I think, yes, mine would be a little more nuanced than Geraldine Fraser-Muleketi's assessment was. I think I would begin by looking at the African Union itself and whether it has made any progress in terms of establishing the institutions that we had anticipated would be established by the African Union. And I believe there has been some progress there. We've also had significant reform of the institution led by a committee of heads of state. I think we're beginning to see much better talent being brought into the organization. I don't believe it's all gloom and doom. I do think there are problems. I wouldn't quarrel with that view, but that's to be anticipated. We also would include in our analysis the very negative impact of external players who wish to continue exploiting the resources of the continent and who often are the ones who stir the conflicts that we see in Africa. So Africa continues due to its very significant natural resources, to be a continent that is exploited. And certainly we need to improve at the leadership level, at our ability to quell this exploitation of the continent. But I certainly would never, in response to how far we've gone, only cite the negative. I have seen what is being done right here in Egypt. I will be visiting their new capital city as part of my visit here, just looking at the whole new city development, which we are also setting about on in South Africa. I've seen what's happening in Ghana with respect to railway infrastructure. I've seen new roads and highways in Uganda and Senegal. So I do have a different perspective looking on the ground in the various countries. I've also been very pleased at the progress many African countries have made with respect to access to education, not just primary or basic schooling, but secondary and university education as well. But I wouldn't gloss over the problems, particularly our failure to silence the guns and unconstitutional changes of government. And I'm glad that we're having a summit later this week focused on this very subject and taking a very realistic look and assessment of what we need to do as the continent to address these negatives that continue to bedevil us.
And let's go through some of them, and Minister, perhaps issue by issue, or item by item, starting with what Geraldine Fraser-Umlegete calls a leadership deficit. And it's interesting that you are saying that there has been a lot of talent coming through. And the reason that is particularly interesting for me is because a lot of people have been saying, over the past few years especially, that they are not seeing emerging from the continent the kind of leadership that you saw, for example, when your President Mbeki's, your Olusegun Obasanjo's, and those people really took up the cudgels and made sure that they were leading from the front constantly and consistently. So when you then say, well, you have the benefit, obviously, as you have just said, of being on the ground and of seeing these things. It's your daily, a day-to-day job. Talk to us about that talent. Who are they, and where are they? What are they doing? Where are they to be seen? Doing what exactly?
Well, I think. I always have a real difficulty with analysts who look at one aspect when assessing particular criteria. So for me, while leaders may be important, they're not the sole measure that I utilize. I'm thinking, for example, of the scientific achievement by a professor in the Democratic Republic of Congo, who has done amazing work in the HIV/AIDS arena to the degree that he won the Emperor's Prize in Japan. And we as Africans were all there celebrating this amazing scientific research and innovation. I'm thinking of African countries that have begun to launch their own satellites developed by space scientists in their country. In fact, we've just, with our South African Space Agency, signed a collaboration protocol with Egypt's space agency. So there are many areas. We've seen an increased number of PhDs in sciences and engineering produced on the African continent. There's been a huge growth in universities focused on science and medicine studies, and we're producing many more doctors and engineers. So I do think one has to look at a wide range of criteria and not limit yourself to leaders, because leaders are not the total sum of what makes up a nation or a continent.
Well, on that one, I'm sure one would also add, we've seen the recognition of some of our own vice chancellors, for example, University of Johannesburg, as well as Wits universities being recognized, by world bodies that are, decision makers in their own right. Now, but then do these, this leadership core, is it able in very real and meaningful ways to influence the reforms that you are talking about? In other words, is there space? Has the AU and its structures been able to create space for these thought leaders to actually influence decisions that your heads of state and ministers like you get to discuss?
I think it's happening. Sometimes it's incremental, it's at a slow pace, but the change is there. For example, I was listening to Professor Eddie Maloka reporting on the African peer review mechanism and the number of African countries that have now been open to being reviewed by their peers and looking at issues of governance, socioeconomic progress, and all the criteria that are assessed by independent peers on looking at African member states. And over 40 countries have now opened themselves up to that review, including South Africa, that has just completed a second review, whose report we are currently studying. So I think there is progress, and there's much more attention, in my view, to issues of development than there has been before. I would say if you went to more than half the countries on the continent, you would find that each of them has quite a coherent infrastructure plan, that a number are investing in agriculture, that many are concerned and giving attention to the matter of water resources and what we do to improve access to water resources. I've made mention of education. With the COVID-19 pandemic, you would be aware that many countries turned to the issue of improved public health systems. So, in my view, Africa is on the march. And the question I am attending to as a South African is, how can our country, which has a significant accomplishments in a range of areas, how can it play a role in advancing the key development goals of the African continent? I am not one who resides in lamentation. I, of course, don't neglect recognition of the reality where there is failure, but my approach to work is what can be done to remedy the problem. And this is the focus we've agreed with my colleague, Minister Shukri, here. We're not going to do more planning. We're actually going to be focused on our objectives, and we're going to try to ensure we have incremental progress in a number of key sectors he and I and our officials have agreed upon.
But also, of course, and just to go back, Geraldine Fraser-Mlekete, in her assessment, wasn't talking about all gloom and doom. She was just being frank about acknowledging the things, the targets that were met, the things that have gone wrong. She did go on to talk about a lot of positives. I just thought I should perhaps say that. But we should, I believe, lament, the fact that we haven't been able to completely silence the guns. We should lament the fact that we have had several coups over the past few years. That's taking us back.
It absolutely does, and it's a matter of great concern. Hence, the summit that we're having just this week of the African Union, where for the first time, we are going to have a very deliberate discussion on unconstitutional changes of government on the continent and what we need to do as the African Union member states to begin to reverse this phenomenon which has occurred far too often in the last year and a half. So it is a concern that occupies all of us. It's linked to the failures of security on the continent. I think you would see that the coups are really very strongly present in countries that have been victims of the incursions by terrorists. I'm trying to be brief, but I see you've got other aspects of the program, but really the matter of unconstitutional changes of government is being attended to and is something that we will focus upon as the African Union.
You mentioned earlier, Minister, external players who go on to or continue to exploit the continent. And some people may argue that there are new ones that are doing what our former colonizers used to do, albeit differently. Who are these people, and how are they successful, in destabilizing the continent?
Some of them tend to be corporate multinationals that have contracts in various countries on the continent, either to develop mineral resources or exploit particular commodities. What they do is they do not involve local communities. They don't value add in the countries in which the minerals are found. And so you develop a very strong antagonism between the community, and it looks at the government as being the reason for the failings in terms of access to a quality livelihood. So this failure of some of our international corporate agreements. Secondly, there are countries that at times come into the continent under the guise of providing security assistance. We've seen some of this in the Central African Republic. And instead of playing the role of supporting in enhancing security, they actually are more focused on diamonds, gold, cobalt, and other minerals. This is something that we've got to really give attention to. And I think it's a matter we need to place at the center of the United Nations as the African Union, and ensure that the UN assists us in curbing this exploitation, neo-colonial exploitation of the resources of Africa, because it is holding us back. We must also make real implementation of the core objectives of the African Continental Free Trade Area, because value addition and high-level manufacturing are part of the framework for a continental free trade area and intra-African trade. So I think the work that our trade ministers are doing on the AFCFTA is very important work. And again, I bring in the innovators are key to ensuring that we have that manufacturing and value addition. So what needs to be done is clear. The key is that we must implement.
But should we also not be as... Minister, should we also not be should we not be a lot harsher on ourselves as well? Because these people you're talking about, or these external players, do so with sometimes our own concurrents, our leaders who, are satisfied with getting crumbs, falling from these people's tables, corruption, lack of leadership, and so on. Should we not be harsh on ourselves as well on that one?
I think you're absolutely correct that, corruption is a large part of the problematique that we have on our continent. However, I don't think it's limited to political leaders. I think in many of our countries, corruption is very widely practiced. And so we have to make sure we have robust mechanisms that can support us in the fight against corruption. I'm glad that in South Africa, we are giving attention to this, as are several countries on the continent. But it is one of the really bad features of business practice in Africa. The presence of corruption, very widespread, practiced by many sectors, many individuals, and we need to ensure that we end it.
Lastly, Minister, I've taken much more than the time I was meant to take on this, but Agenda 2063 is about creating the Africa we want. Economics, peace, development, everything you can think of. Geraldine Fraser Mlegeti spoke about the Agenda 2063 scorecard. On a scale of 1 to 10, given where we are, where would you say we are in terms of, meeting those objectives?
Well, I believe we haven't gone as far as we could. So if I were perhaps to be generous, I'd say 4.5 out of 10, because I am aware that there are initiatives. But I think we should be doing much more. We have 10-year plans for implementing the various phases of Agenda 2063. I now am happier since last year that we've set up a proper monitoring mechanism in the African Union, and we're giving devoted attention to ensuring that the various sectoral projects are being practically implemented. But I don't think we've been able to really achieve the aspirations that Dr. Dlamini Zuma had anticipated when she introduced Agenda 2063 to the African Union as its Commission chairperson.
Minister, that's where we're going to leave it. Thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thank you.
That's our International Relations Minister, Dr. Naledi Pandor, coming through to us from Cairo, Egypt, where she is, of course, on a country duty. We're talking about Africa Day, and after the break, this year's Africa Day theme focuses on the importance of addressing malnutrition and food insecurity on the continent. We speak to an expert about where things are, what challenges we are still facing, and how we can overcome them. Africa must unite to minimize dependency on foreign aid and food imports from outside the continent. That's a sentiment shared by speakers at Africa Day celebrations at the University of Limpopo. The provincial government hosted the event with the theme, Building Resilience in the Nutrition for the African Continent, which is today's theme.
Africa spends billions of US dollars every year importing basic necessities such as food from other regions. Over 30% of the continent's wheat imports come from Russia and Ukraine. With the two countries at war, the continent is already bearing the brunt as food prices skyrocket. Government authorities and academics believe it's crucial for African countries to unite to form intercontinental cooperation.
What aspects do we have as a continent that will help us go beyond and get rid of the issues of dependency? And nutrition is one of them. And that over a period of time, because of other factors, including commercialization of food and other aspects, they've deprived the communities around the continent of the livelihood and other areas that traditionally people were living on. And that's why then the government has put in a theme for this year to be resilience of nutrition.
University of Limpopo boasts one of the most resourceful science and agricultural faculties in Africa. The university aims to work with other universities on the continent to help countries produce more food. But South Africa also needs other African countries.
The continent also has a lot to offer. Remember, climate is not the same. What Africa has, what South Africa has, other countries don't have. The climate in the DRC, for example, rainfall-wise, is much better than ours. So what I'm saying is more about collaboration. Remember, our motto is finding solutions for Africa, which means working with others rather than helping them.
Meanwhile, University of Limpopo students have also shared their views on Africa Day.
We are all, as people, we unite. As we are African, we show humanity. We treat everyone as we are equal.
We are celebrating maybe the diverse cultures that are here in Africa. The day we acknowledge each other about the cultures that are found in Africa.
Africa Day is also aimed at encouraging conversations and dialogue, as well as combating xenophobia. Rutando Bobori, SABC News in Mankweng.
Across the continent, Africans still facing serious development challenges, including food insecurity and increasing malnutrition. The problems are compounded by global crises of all sorts, including the current war in Ukraine, the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as climate change. But just how serious is this crisis? And most importantly, what can we do to reverse it? Well, Dr. Blessing Masama is a specialist in food security. He's also a postdoctoral fellow at the Africa Institute of South Africa program of the HSRC. Good evening, Doc. Thank you very much for your time. Just how serious is the issue of food insecurity and malnutrition in South Africa first?
Thank you for your good evening and good evening, viewers. I want to thank you for this opportunity to share on this important subject of food insecurity and malnutrition in Africa as a whole. I want to start by joining other fellow Africans to actually commemorate the Africa Day, which has been commemorated since 1963. And despite the challenges that we still face as Africa, we have made some significant progress. But today we are focusing more, as you said, on the theme, the Africa's Year of Nutrition for 2022. Africa still faces a challenge in food insecurity and nutrition. And to be specific, South Africa is not spared. And South Africa as a nation at large, at national level, is regarded as food secure. But at the household level, there are widespread reports of food insecurity and malnutrition. So South Africa as a country faces dire challenges of malnutrition and food insecurity. And with this, you have South Africa going through a nutrition transition where there is a high consumption of high energy foods, high energy dense foods that actually provide results in overweight, that results in malnutrition, stunting, wasting, and so forth. So South Africa is still going through a challenge of nutrition cascading from the household food insecurity status. Hence, it is important that today, as we look at the strides Africa has made so far, we need to focus more on how South Africa has fared, which needs, it has done a number of aspects, yes, but there is still a lot to be done to address the food insecurity and malnutrition. And to be specific.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what are the challenges? Because I've noticed over the past couple of days as we were building towards this day, I mean, people talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, talking about the war in Ukraine. Those are fairly recent crises, you know. This problem has been there. People like you have been talking about it for years now. So I want us to like cut them out of the equation, so to speak, for a while, and perhaps speak to how we got here, how we got to have this problem.
For South Africa in specific, thank you for that. The challenges actually dates back to the apartheid era, where there were a lot of inequalities, institutionalized inequalities, probed by the issues of inequality in terms of land ownership, which actually results in a limited agricultural productivity. So there's been limited access to productive resources, on which actually talks about the availability dimension of food security, which then actually retards the production of food at the household level. And hence, most communities would end up relying mainly on the accessing food, buying food from the markets. This is the predominant way in which most South African communities rely on to access food. So because of limited income as well, they cannot buy nutritious foods, they cannot buy food that is actually required, balanced enough to enhance nutrition, particularly for vulnerable groups like children and mothers. So you would find that coupled with that, there's been changes in climatic conditions, extreme events that have resulted in changing rainfall patterns and weather conditions that are ideal for food production. And relying on that, you would see that hence there will be a widespread of food unavailability amongst rural communities, to be specific. So it starts from there, but it compounds itself with those aspects of changing climatic conditions, and you will see that the pandemic, the outbreak of the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, actually exacerbated the inaccessibility to food, because of the limited income, because of the limited access to productive resources. So to address that, a number of strides of interventions have been done, but there still needs a lot to be done in order to assist most of the vulnerable communities to actually access food. Because you would still report at national level that people are food secure, but yet the disparities that are more that emanates from the household level and at the individual level, looking at the nutrition status, you'd see that there is wide by those communities that are chronic, and also the standing malnutrition and so forth. So you see that there still needs to be done, but it dates back to the apartheid era, and come forward, we look at the changes that have occurred over time in terms of the climate conditions.
Now the question,
of late, the COVID-19 pandemic.
I mean, we all know that there are conversations going on throughout the world, some under the auspices of United Nations Fora about about climate change. But with regard to the other problems you've alluded to, there's a summit on land, for example, in the next coming days, that's going to be led by the minister responsible for agriculture and land. So the land question hasn't been addressed in South Africa. I mean, more and more people are getting unemployed. Resources are getting scarce, more and more people have to do to live with less. Does it look like, given the combination of all these things, does it look like this problem is going to go away anytime soon?
Thank you, Vuyo, for raising one of the main important determinants of food security and nutrition. The land question still needs to be addressed, as you rightfully put it across, but addressed in legal terms. The legislative framework needs to be put in place that respects the property rights and so forth, but still needs to be addressed. But your question now is looking at, if all this is to continue or is addressed, what is the future of food security and nutrition in South Africa? Yeah, it looks like if it remains like this, the status quo is like this, then we are likely to have a more pronounced or acute food insecurity and malnutrition, because still the interventions that need to come to address these challenges still are to use land as the medium of production. So they are tied, most of these interventions are tied to land. So you would require that the land access, the land holding and land rights need to be addressed, so that majority of those that are able to venture into food production, food crop production, and assisted by other means, loans and so forth, still needs to be done in order to arrest this situation, because it's dire, it's still coming, it's still going, and despite the COVID-19 pandemic going down into probably the endemic stage, still there are a lot of challenges that South Africa is facing. So there's need to address this land issue, but still efforts need to be made now, because as I said, the interventions that need to come into place and address this issue are tied to land, agricultural productivity. Yes. Okay.
Doc, that's where we're going to leave it for this evening. Thank you very much for your time and your insights. Dr. Blessing Masama, who is a specialist in food security, is also a postdoctoral fellow at the Africa Institute of South Africa program of the HSRC, speaking to that theme for this year's Africa Day, food and nutrition, the food and nutrition crisis we're currently having on the continent, and South Africa is not spared, as he just said. We leave you with former President Thabo Mbeki's famous "I am an African" speech made in Cape Town on the 8th of May 1996 on the occasion of the passing of the new constitution of South Africa. Mbeki was the country's deputy president at the time under the presidency of Nelson Mandela. Do enjoy it, and do enjoy what's left of your Africa Day. Have a good night.
I am an African. I owe my being to the hills and the valleys, the mountains and the glades, the rivers, the deserts, the trees, the flowers, the seas, and the ever-changing seasons that define the face of our native land. My body has frozen in our frosts and in our latter-day snows. It has thawed in the warmth of our sunshine and melted in the heat of the midday sun. The crack and the rumble of the summer thunders, lashed by startling lightning, have been a cause both of trembling and of hope. The fragrances of nature have been as pleasant to us as the sight of the wild blooms of the citizens of the veldt. The dramatic shapes of the Drakensberg, the soil-colored waters of the Likwa, Iqeli, Notugela, and the sands of the Kalahari have all been panels of the set on the natural stage on which we act out the foolish deeds of the theater of the day. At times, and in fear, I have wondered whether I should concede equal citizenship of our country to the leopard and the lion, the elephant and the springbok, the hyena, the black mamba, and the pestilential mosquito. A human presence among all of these, a feature on the face of our native land just defined, I know that none dare challenge me when I say I am an African.